All right. So I want to talk about what was covered yesterday in class, kind of going over some of the tools that we used in Photoshop, how Photoshop can work with Illustrator, and also kind of go a little bit more in depth into what the resolution 300 versus 150 versus 72. Um, so to start, talking about resolution is I discussed about different images that you're going to be using for to wrap up this project. Definitely the postcard, possibly the A-frame as well. I want you to think about how you can incorporate text into the imagery, right? So when you're looking at different images for what you're going to be using it for, you don't want to just look at it as just the image itself, because sometimes when you're looking at it on its own, you're saying, this is probably a little bit more exciting, this one here, as opposed to something like this or this. But remember, you need to incorporate text into the imagery. So if you end up using something that is a little bit more complicated, a little bit more exciting, it then makes it a little bit more difficult to incorporate text into it, right? So therefore, the type will become difficult to read. Therefore, the design itself suffers, the readability of the type suffers. So you want to remember, when you're making your choices, always remember how that choice is going to be used into the context of the design itself. The second part is really the resolution. Now, everything that you see on screen is going to be low res. It's going to be, 72 or 150 DPI. But you really want to make sure that you have 300 DPI. All right. So when you're looking at different imagery, and when you want to get something that's going to fill the entire page, you want to know what resolution you should be getting, right? So even if you were using this stock here, right? So we wanted to use this background texture, kind of sticking with my examples from the beginning of the project for the project brief. You can see over here there are two options here, right? So a large and a small. The large being almost 5,000 pixels wide by 3,200 high. The small, you drop down and you're looking at 1686 by 1127. So it's a significant jump in between those two. It's also a big difference between the pricing, right? So when you want to look at imagery and you start thinking about buying stock photography, or even if you end up telling a photographer that you need resolution for a certain project, you got to know what you need to start with. Now, everything on screen is going to be low res. Everything that comes out of the printer, you want to be aiming for the 300 DPI. Okay, that's the goal. Sometimes you can't hit that. Sometimes with digital printing, you could be a little bit less. I do think the bare minimum of what you should hit is 150. Anything less than that, you're going to start seeing a noticeable difference in digital printing. So ideally 300, but if it's a worst case scenario, 150. When you're looking at Photoshop and say you don't even know what size it should be, right? If you come up here and just very quickly create a new document, and you know that the postcard size you're using is 5x7, right? So right here, type in the 5x7. You should also increase it a little bit for the bleed that you have to have incorporated, right? Make sure it's a 300 for the DPI. You can ignore the RGB for at the moment. You hit create. It's going to go through. It's going to create the document, and then you can go up to image. You can go to image size, and you will see the pixels. So now you know at 300 DPI, printing at 5x7, I need to make certain that my document or the photo I'm going to be using is at least 2145 wide by 1545 high. All right, so that's kind of how you quickly gauge, what size I even need, and where to go from that. Even other websites, when you're grabbing stock photography, right? So in here, I want to use this one. I'll be able to put text in the background. And then you can see, the different resolutions here, right? So if you don't need this one, then you don't get that one, right? Because it's going to be a different in price. So therefore, you can go with a smaller resolution. It also means, depending on the type of camera. So say you're going to be taking your own photo, if you need a much lower quality or not as high quality, rather, image, then maybe you can get away with using, a sub par photo method instead of making sure that the image that you take is the highest quality possible. All right. All right. So some of the other tools. So that kind of goes over what I discussed with the resolution and DPI. Um, the next thing that I went over is thinking about the consistency and branding. All right. So some of the things I looked at was how can you replace a color very quickly. So in here, actually I'm going to open up all of these at once. Eventually, there we go. All right, so the first thing is looking at this image here. So let's say I just want to change out the red. I no longer want this red apple, right? I want it to be more green, or maybe my color scheme, for whatever reason, with the branding, it's going to be something different. What you can try to do first is come up to image, go to adjust, and go to hue saturation. In here, you're going to have these three levels: hue, saturation, and lightness. If you adjust the hue, and you can see how you are changing the entire red in the document, well, it's changing everything. It's even changing the whole background. So it's not just the apple itself, but you can see you can adjust the hue, and it's effectively changing the color of the image itself. The saturation you can adjust as well. The lightness and darkness, I generally, in this scenario, I'm not going to touch it. Basically, you can see that it just adjusts the entire darkness and lightness of the photo itself. But this works to change a color that in the entire document of what you want. Now, let's say that we want to go to this one and we want to adjust the color of the apple. Well, the problem with this is that we end up having the stem here, right? So if we just simply go up to here, adjust, go to hue saturation, and then stop playing around with it, you can see that it's adjusting the green in the document as well. It's not just the red apple, it's also the green leaf, all right? So what you can do here is you can go to image, adjust, and replace. So if you use replace color, and then you have this here, you're going to have a little eye drop. You click the eye drop, you can see everything that's red is selected. And now I'm going to adjust this color. You can see that this is selected and it's adjusting just that color. To the right of that eye drop is an eye drop with a plus symbol. So you can click this and you can start selecting more of the actual apple itself. All right. Now, the minus obviously does the complete opposite, right? So if you accidentally select something, you can go in and deselect it. But you can see how this helps select just part of the apple, and now you adjust just that while leaving this alone. All right, so that's another method that you can go into and make that adjustment. Now, let's say that you have this, right? And you need to isolate just one of these apples in the entire group and make that change. Well, you're not going to be able to go up and hit select and replace because all of this is red. So it's going to select everything. So you need to isolate out this entire apple. All right, so to do that, you go into your paths, you create a new path, you can zoom in a bit, and then use your pen tool, and you end up clipping around this entire apple. I'm going to go as quickly as I can so I don't end up boring. I'm just going to go around and ignore these. Now remember, as I'm drawing and clipping around, I'll keep my left hand on the command key. So this way, as I'm going around, I can quickly adjust the handles by holding the command and then getting the arrow to make those adjustments on that. When you get to a certain area like this that you want to go this way, you can see if I click again, it's going to come off this, right? So you need to click by holding Option and then click the anchor point, and now I can go in a different direction. All right, so we have our path right here, and I have that all the way around. Now I want to make a selection. So I hold Option Command, and I can click this apple, okay? So now with that selected, I can go back into my layer, and then I can go to Adjust and go to Hue Saturation, and now I can adjust just that apple, all right? You can also hit Command H to hide the selection. So this way, as you're making changes, you don't have that selection. Um, but that's a way that you can isolate one element out of the entire image itself. All right. All right. So the next thing was looking at a way of bringing in your color scheme. So you have, with your branding, you have your entire color scheme. And let's say I want to have these coffee beans to be my color scheme, right? So if I want to have, well, first, say if I want to have a monochromatic, right? So if I want to have it green and going into white, I can go here. So I have my green in the foreground, white in the background, go to image, adjustments. Now I'm going to go to gradient map right here. This is going to take these two colors and apply it together across my entire design, right? So you can see, right here with the gradient map, I get green to white. Now let's say that I have a green and I'm going to have some purple, all right? So these are my two color schemes here. I'm going to go up to adjust, go to gradient map, and now you can see it pulls at this end, right? I can hit, if I make a mistake, I can hit reverse. So this way then it puts the purple in front and then the green in the highlight. If I click inside this gradient, I can then pull this up and adjust how this gets affected. I can adjust where this kind of pulls in. I can even click in here and bring a whole nother color in to the design, right? If I make a mistake and I don't like that idea, I can click on that paint and pull down and get rid of it. So there's more adjustments you can do even after you hit this, all right? So you can kind of fine tune all of this. Once you have that all set, then you can hit save, and then you can use this document in your Illustrator file or later on in InDesign. All right, so then the other thing that I went over in class, I discussed gamut, making sure you keep all your colors in gamut. Now, everything we see on screen is RGB. Everything that we see printed is CMYK. So essentially, the two methods do not go hand in hand, especially with greens and blues. All right, so right here, I'm going to pull this green. You can see how vibrant and bright and nuclear that green is. That won't print, okay? It's ineffectively out of gamut. It will not give you the CMYK print. So if you ever see this caution sign pop up, you know you're out of gamut. If you click it, it will drop it back down, all right? So you can see right here, this is what it would be printed. I just changed a bit. Yeah, and then you can see how it changes, right? You can't ignore it. Even if you keep it like this and you try and use it in your document, the printer's not going to be able to print it. So always make sure you set yourself up for actually seeing the design, the color that you're going to be using as it's going to happen on the printer. All right, so it's important to keep all of your documents and all of your color choices in check. All right, so then the next thing was bringing images into Illustrator. So we want to bring this into Illustrator. What you do is anything that is going to be print, you want to first make sure it is CMYK. So you go up to Mode, make sure it's in CMYK. Then it's always good to make sure that the resolution is set up properly. So remember, you could create a new document to check out what your resolution is. You always want to see what your file is set up for at 300 dpi. Generally, everything that you download, right, off of the web is always going to be low res. It's going to be 72 dpi. So we come up to here, we go to image size, and right here you can see 72. The pixels is 1049, 699, and this is always default in Photoshop. It's selected for the resample. You can see these two are connected to keep everything proportionate. If we deselect resample, we now have three lines together. So that now tells me that, if I change the resolution, it's going to change the actual size. Because at 72 dpi, if you were to put up a square inch over, it's 72 bits of information inside that square inch. That's 72, right? If we change this to 150, essentially almost half, it now makes the physical size half of what it was, but it keeps the actual size itself. Like the image size with all the information in there has not changed. all that change is it squeezed all that information down, so it ends up becoming a much higher resolution image. So then when we go to the proper 300 DPI, you can see that actual file to print at 300 can only be printed at 3.5 by 2 1/3. So that is the biggest that this size, this file should be printed at. Okay, so then we hit OK, and now we got to save it. Anything that is a flat piece of art, anything that is a photo that doesn't have a background knocked out or anything else, should be saved as a TIFF. So you go up to File, Save As, and then select the format options, and then check off TIFF, and then hit Save. Hit OK, and now we have our TIFF. So now we want to bring this into our Illustrator file. Okay, so to bring it in, you can link it, right? So if you prefer to have files linked to external, you can do it that way. Something like this, where you're only going to end up having one image to work with, embed it. All right, so in here, open with, go to Illustrator, you open that up in Illustrator, and then you just copy it from that file into your own file. Eventually. There we go. So we select it, Command C, and close this out, and Command V. So now we have this file in here. It is now part of it. It's not a link, right? So if something happens, we forget to copy this over, or we throw it away by accident, it will not affect this. This is not linked, okay? The downside to that is if we were creating a much larger file with a lot more images, the Illustrator file is going to become very heavy and clunky. It will definitely chug and cause issues down the line. But with only one image and we're creating one postcard, that's not going to be an issue. All right, so we have this file in here. Some of the things we discussed in yesterday, creating masks. So to start, I had a text mask. And then if you just simply put text over an image, let's make it bold. And then I select the image and the text together, and I hit Command 7. That takes the image and places it into the mask of that text, okay? You can also draw shapes. So if I wanted this to be a circle, I'll come up here, I'll create a circle, and then I select the circle and the image together, Command 7, all right? Now, let's say that we have a logo or individual pieces. So I'm going to, let's do this. I'm going to delete this, I'm going to move this in here, and then I'm going to convert these into outlines, and then I'm going to unite them using the Pathfinder. Let me go to Window, go down to Pathfinder, pull this in, and then I hit Unite. All right, so now this is one object ready to go. If I select both of these and hit Command 7, it all disappears. All right, if I hit Command Y, you can see my image is still there, but it's just not showing up. What's happening is Illustrator, when you have multiple items in trying to create a mask, it sees it as two separate things. All right, so you need to make sure that Illustrator sees it as one. So anytime that you try to create a mask and it's not working, select the object that you want to create the mask in. Go up to Object, Compound Path, and hit Make. This is going to strip away all the attributes that's associated with this object and now make it one. So now when we select that text and the image in the background, hit Command 7, it will work. I would say 9 out of 10 times when you try and create a mask and it's not working properly, that's the culprit. That's what you need to do. So select the object that you're trying to create the mask, go up to Object, go to Compound Path and Make, and then try it again, and it will work. Or it should work. All right, so then the next thing, dragging. So the one thing you never want to do is anything that you want to print, right? So if I wanted this to be part of my design, and I wanted to print it, I should never just drag it in. So in here, you never want to just simply open this Photoshop document and drag in, okay? If you want to bring something in, save it properly as it should, like this, the TIFF, and then open with Illustrator and then bring in. If you're just dragging in, it's going to be like a low res representation of that actual image. If you're using it, let's say that you were going to use it just to kind of like trace around, or what we did at the beginning with the logo and using image trace, then fine. It's never going to print. But anything that you want to print and have it as a quality image, always save it as a file and bring it in that way. All right. Now, the opposite is true when you want to bring something in this way. Let me go to, let's see if I have, I don't. All right. I'll just use this then. So if I have this and I have this object, you can drag from Illustrator into Photoshop. All right. So if I drag from here and drop on top of this, it will bring that image, or that file rather, into Photoshop for me and create a whole separate layer. The advantage of this is it will retain the vector qualities. So if I now want to make this a little bit bigger and scale it, it will not pixelate on me. It keeps it as a vector file. So you can see there's a little icon right here in the bottom right that tells me it's a vector file, right? So this is part of Photoshop, but it's not pixel driven, all right? So if, let's say I'm like, I made a mistake and now I want this to be left aligned, I don't like that it's kind of pushed off, I can just double click the icon. It will open this up in Illustrator for me as a separate file. I can then go in and then make adjustments to this. I'm going to use this to move it over. All right, so then it sits here. Everything's good. I'm going to hit save, and then I'm going to close it because it's a separate file from what I had originally. There it is. It's gone. I come in here, and this automatically updates it. All right, so you don't have to worry about going back in here, fixing that, and then re-dragging it in. Anything that is vector that's dragged in will be able to open back up in Illustrator and make adjustments. All right. The other thing that we kind of talked about was, there are certain ways to blend type over images. I don't, not so much this one here, but let's say that you were using like a different kind of texture. But in here, I have text sitting on here, and I kind of want some of the bean texture to come through the text. If I simply just change the opacity and I hit this at 75, you can see now that text has the background coming through. To the left of the opacity, there are a couple different options for blending. All right, so if I hit multiply, you can see how it kind of blends in and pulls that through. If I use overlay, it does a different thing. If I do color burn, that's going to do something different. So all of these are going to have a couple different ways of incorporating some of that texture to come through. This is definitely useful when you're trying to create a unique way of having the text blend into the background of the image. When I was showing you the examples of these, right? Maybe you don't have just a hard brown or darker tan color sitting here against the window. Maybe we want some of that light to kind of come through that type treatment, all right? It still has to be readable, all right? You want the text to be readable. This is terrible, but it gives you the idea of how you have that sort of blending with those different elements coming through. And then I think that's it. Oh, no. There was one other. So when you're bringing in, this is all with Photoshop. So when you want to have multiple items in one document, never drag from here and just drop into place. All right, because what's going to happen is it sits in here and it's going to be a separate item. So you want to make sure that when you have this sitting there, oops, when you have this and you want to bring another item in, you drag. Let me use this one for example. You have it open side by side and you bring it in this way. All right, so this way then, that document is going to be a cleaner representation of what that image is. And sometimes it causes issues with giving it as like a link. Sometimes it causes issues in that you can't adjust anything with that layer, and then you have to rasterize that layer. So always try and bring in images by opening them up separately and then dragging from one to the other. Now you can see, I can see Illustrator and Photoshop open at once. This is only possible by having this turned off. All right, by default, all of the Adobe software is going to have application frame selected. If you deselect it, you're able to show Illustrator and Photoshop files side by side. Later on, when we're working in InDesign, you're going to want that too. You're going to want to be working in Illustrator and then bringing things into InDesign. The same thing with Photoshop. You're going to want to be able to see what you're trying to create and see both windows open. So it's useful to have this capability and having all the programs visible at once. The last thing that I kind of want to reiterate that I kept seeing a few, not everybody, there was just a couple students, was this idea of what the bleed is, right? So when you download this template, so if you were to go to Moo and you had your template and you said, all right, I want my finished postcard to be the 5x7, you can see it's telling you that it's, it has to be, 0.5 bleed all the way around. So when you download it, this is what it's showing. All right. Remember, in your the layers itself, you want to make sure that you're not putting your artwork in the artwork that's not going to print, right? So if we double click this, you can see that print is turned off. Where this one here, the print is turned on. So you just want to make sure that that document has, or rather, you're using that layer in the document itself. You can see this here to this edge, that is where it's going to be cut. All right, so that's the trim line. The inside dotted line, that's your margin. That's the bare minimum. You should really make that a little bit wider, okay, just to bring in a little bit more of a bleed, I'm sorry, a little bit more of open space and bringing in some more of that consistency around the edges. This is just simply having the absolute worst case scenario. You don't want anything cut off in your document, okay? So when you have something, so if I was to use this and I wanted this to kind of go off the edge, I don't bring it to this line. I bring it all the way to the bleed line. So this way then, if it does shift, it wouldn't have any kind of white sliver to the design itself. It allows this to get cut off, all right? So just, remember that you need to make sure that your designs are going to the edges of what you're creating. The other thing was when we created, so we go up here, we go to new. When we created this document and wanted to create with the trim lines and for us to print, there is no trim lines here, right? If we go, let me close this. If I go to File, Save As, it's just showing up again. And then I save it to the desktop. I'm going to save it as a PDF and then hit save. And then even if I go to marks and bleeds and hit trim marks and hit save, what's going to happen is, because this is a template for Moo, that document is set up for them to print properly. Why is this not? There we go. So this here is actually going to the pink. So this is actually going to cut off, or rather the trim lines is on the outside. Because what's happening is Moo knows that this full document that is 7.15 by 5.15 will be cut down to 7 by 5. All right. But we need it to be 7 by 5 with our own bleed. All right. So if we create a new document for us to be able to print in the classroom, we're going to hit new. We got a 7 by 5, and then we need to make it half, right? So it is 0.5, so it's going to be 0.75 all the way around. Okay, CMYK, hit create, and then now you can see that we have a document sitting here, and then we have our bleed here. All right, so now so maybe this will help illustrate. So I'm gonna hit copy, V. I'm gonna bring this all the way past the bleed line. All right, so now when I go to save this, save as, and then hit this version 2. I'm gonna go to PDF, hit save. Make sure I go to marks and bleeds. I have trim marks, hit save. So now when I show this, see how now the trim marks are sitting here? So now this will get cut off and that will get cut off. So you just want to make sure when you're creating your document and you're going to be printing in-house, you have to make sure your document is set here with a bleed. So the trim marks are going to go here to here. But when you download something from a website that is a template, if this was sending to printer and you're going to be sending it to Moo, you would not save it as a PDF with trim marks. They don't want it. They know that their document, they're cutting off 0.15 all the way around your document to have a finished size of 7 by 5. But in the classroom, when we're creating and printing and then cutting it out ourselves, you got to have that trim line right here and there. All right. So that's it. That's what we had covered yesterday. Hopefully it helps for you. But if you do have any questions, please email me. Remember, tomorrow we're going to have our first class crit. So you'll have about an hour to wrap up whatever you need to finish in the 3 different projects: the postcard, the A-frame, and then the shirt design. All right. So hope you have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.